I've always thought that John Dee was a pretty shady character. I assumed he was a Freemason, an occultist, and a magician doing black magic. Just to look for his books on Amazon, The Queen's Conjure, Enochian Vision Magic, the Complete Enochian Dictionary, and he's said to have been revealed the Enochian alphabet, which is supposed to be the correct alphabet used for magic. Of course, up here we get the upside down pentagram, and here is a Star of Rimfam with his spiritual diary, John Dee's occultism, and the lost art of Enochian magic. So, it goes on and on. YouTube videos will show you stuff like the real sorcerers of history, John Dee, and associate him with guys like Aleister Crowley. Here we got Enochian calls, the language Enoch used to communicate with angels. John Dee, the master of darkness, and Queen Elizabeth's magician, John Dee. Of course, Ghostmane's video about John Dee, where he says, I wake up in the morning looking like I'm John Dee, and it appears more of a horror film than anything. But recently in my Tartarian Christianity series, we're looking at the Tartarians and how they are a Christian nation. A lot of the information comes from this book right here, Purchas His Pilgrims. This is volume 11, and Purchas His Pilgrims turns out to be it's a 20-book set. And the volume we've been reading from on Tartaria is right here, volume 11. So quite the collection of books. I would love to have this set sitting on my library shelf. And of course, volume 11, really great book exposing some truth about Tartaria, Genghis Khan, and possibly some connections to the book of Revelation. So here I am doing some flat earth research and digging up old maps. This one is of the North Pole, and we have 4 islands along with the large black magnetic rock at the center, which the compasses all point to. Of course, that's Rupes Nagra, and Mercator in his 1620 map showed it just like this. And this black rock, along with the Phantom Islands, 4 Phantom Islands up there, is believed to be a 33-mile wide black rock. Interesting that the black rock is 33 miles wide. Here's a version of that, as well as another one from the world map of Ptolemy in 1508, with the 4 islands, one of them being Hyperborea, and the whirlpool around the magnetic stone. And that there's a circumpolar mountain range in latitude 78 to 79 degrees north. And here there is a lofty, shining black rock of magnetic stone, 33 Masonic miles in circumference. That is to say, about 10 miles across. And here the ocean waters swirled around in a whirlpool and were sucked down into the bowels of the earth. And the 4 indrawing seas separated by 4 land areas. 2 of them that Mercator and Royish agreed were inhabited, and 2 were not. So here we are on John Dee's map with the magnetic black rock and 4 islands going around the North Pole. Over here we have Cathay, so this is Tartaria. This would be where the Bering Strait crosses over to America. And John Dee is calling all of that area, still calling it Cathay. And crossing over there, of course, is North America. And in North America, we have Quiveria and California, not labeled, but certainly cities over here in North America and Canada. Cities, not only is Quiveria a city, but also here, another city, another one here. And you can say Mercator and Dee believed in a sphere Earth if you want, but as far as I'm concerned, this is flat Earth theory, because it puts a magnetic stone at the North Pole, which is the cause for compasses pointing north. And really, this is, it lines up with flat Earth theory. It certainly doesn't align with sphere Earth. So I said, well, John Dee, the flat earther, that instantly makes him a lot more interesting. And here we go again, a totally different map, 1580. And it's a map of North America, but going north. What do we have up here? But the four mystical lost islands at the North Pole, 90 degrees north. And when you examine John Dee's writing, it becomes clear that his ideas were more valuable than scholars have admitted. And in addition to these maps, Dee also wrote a number of books. Some of them are published, some of them are not. The first one, A General and Rare Memorials Pertaining to the Perfect Art of Navigation, written in 1576 to promote Frobisher's voyage and the trading goals of the Muscovy Company. The Muscovy Company. Well, that is an interesting name in connection to Tartarians. Of course, the Muscovites. Now, the Perfect Art of Navigation is in the second volume, the British complement of the Perfect Art of Navigation, which is now lost. Completed between September and December of 1576, the subject was our Queen Elizabeth, her tables for longitude and latitude, finding most easily and speedily, if need be, without sight of the sun, moon, or star. And that is GPS. I mean, GPS allows you to get your longitude and latitude without the sight of the sun, moon, or star. I don't know how you're going to do it in the 1500s without the sight of any celestial object. Nobody back then knew how to get, especially your longitude. There was a huge problem with trying to figure out what your longitude was. Latitude wasn't so hard for them historically, but longitude took a long time to figure out, and it's called the problem of longitude. So how in 1576 did John Dee figure out how to determine longitude and latitude without needing the sun, moon, or star? The only solution we have today for that is the GPS unit. And Dee wrote a second part of that called Of Famous and Rich Discoveries, written in 1577. So here's a list of the works of John Dee. Some of them were published, some not. The following books were printed. So these ones are printed and are pretty much available. But turning the page, we get to the unprinted books. Some are complete, some are unfinished. Of that, we have the great volume of Rich and Famous Discoveries, which includes the history of King Solomon, all 3 years of his Ophirian voyage. In 1 Kings chapter 9, it talks about Solomon's other activities, and one of them is that King Solomon built ships, and Hiram Abiff sent his men to Ophir, and they brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. And apparently this happened every 3 years, or the voyage took 3 years. But the Ophirian voyages are a biblical concept. And if we turn to the next chapter, it says that Solomon received gold, and the weight that he received yearly was 666 talents. So I'm not sure, King Solomon is all that good of a guy, associated right here with the number 666 as far as his wealth is concerned. So it's very interesting that John Dee wrote in his Famous and Rich Discoveries of the history of King Solomon and the 3 years of his Ophirian voyage. Next up, we have the original work of Prester John, of the first great Khan and his successors. Now, Prester John comes up all the time in Tartarian research. Prester John is associated with this Tartarian Christianity series. He is the ruler of Tartaria after Genghis Khan, not through direct lineage, but through marriage. And on a map like this, when it talks about all of the topics, including Marco Polo, the tribes of Dan and the tribes of Naphtali, the lost 10 tribes of Israel, Arzareth, where the lost 10 tribes were sent to. And here we have Argon, the Christian kingdom, and the ruler is Prester John. So in Tartaria, in Arzareth or Kambalu, which is the capital city of Tartaria, and the area that's called Tinduk or Cathay. Prester John is associated with Christianity, and he's also the king of Tartaria. So quite interesting. John Dee is writing on Prester John. Next up, we have the description of diverse, wonderful islands in the north. And I think this description of islands in the north, wonderful islands, is describing these islands up here. Wonderful islands in the north, Scythian, Tartarian, and most other northern seas near and under the North Pole, from 1,200-year-old records and other diverse rarities. Now this sounds like a book that I want to read. Famous and Rich Discoveries by John Dee. In reference to the perfect art of navigation, there is evidence to suggest that the Queen herself suppressed its distribution because she was interested in keeping secret many of Dee's ideas. 2 extant writings, which is books that are extinct, of rich and famous discoveries, and despite Dee's best efforts, it was not published and probably never seen by any central government. Some of the early chapters were published by Samuel Purchas in 1625, and it seems likely that the book was in the possession of Dee and Purchas. And this is a purchase from Purchas His Pilgrims. So there's the first volume, The British Monarchy, the second volume, The British Complement, which says it's larger in bulk than the English Bible and was written in 4 months and finished in December. It was never published because it would cost so much to print it. But the third volume was mysterious. It was to be utterly suppressed or delivered to Vulcan, his custody. And the fourth was Famous and Rich Discoveries, a book for British honor and wealth, and as great godly pleasure as worldly profit and delight. It was a work of great historical research, which never saw the light. So Dee spent a lot of time on great historical research, wrote a huge book about it in Famous and Rich Discoveries, which covers the history of King Solomon and his Ophirian voyages, Prester John, wonderful islands in the north, at the North Pole, and information about the Tartarians. Now, Famous and Rich Discoveries is more or less utterly suppressed, but it's saying that the book before this one, the third one, was so mysterious that it was utterly suppressed. And man, I wish I could get my hands on this third volume to figure out what was written in that, because the book before that said that Dee had essentially a GPS unit that could figure out longitude and latitude without the sight of sun, moon, or star. You know, so there's all kinds of stuff that Dee's writing about, which is very interesting. And this Famous and Rich Discoveries, or the fourth volume, would have been extremely expensive to print, 6 times the length of the British Monarchy, so publication would have been hugely expensive. But it described information about Ophir and the, Solomon's voyage, and Solomon commanded his fleet with Hiram Abif's pilots as navigators to go to the land that was called Ophir to fetch him some gold, and John Dee determined that the descent of the Tartarians and the Scythians who inhabited North Europe and Asia from Magog, son of Japhet, son of Noah. Now, interesting that Hiram Abif's pilots are used as pilots and navigators of the ship. And Samuel Purchas talks about, I believe, one of John Dee's compass, he calls it his Ophirian compass. So did John Dee recover some ancient navigation technology, an Ophirian compass, or something related to that, which allowed him to determine longitude and latitude? And according to John Dee, His Rich and Famous Discoveries books and the General and Rare Memorials are significant works, but its unrevealed content or secret center is far more valuable than anything else in the work. By the time of Dees' descriptions of the work written in the 1590s, the secret center is no longer mentioned, and Ophir has become the only first main topic. So here we have a book on Tartaria, Solomon, and what does John Dee think of Rich and Famous Discoveries, Solomon's Voyage, Dees' Survey of Asia or Tartaria, his objects, and scrupulous concern for truth. Now, why does John Dee have a scrupulous concern for truth in his book and his historical studies surrounding the Tartarians and Asia? The third volume contained matters so secret that for the present it was to be utterly suppressed or delivered to Vulcan in his custody. But in Rich and Famous Discoveries, in this present age, will bring to light a matter of great importance and consequence, both for the glory of God and to the benefit of all Christians and heathens, which is connected in some way with his Rich and Famous Discoveries. For in the secret center thereof is more bestowed and stored up than I may or will express. The only surviving clue to this last is perhaps Dees' statement of 1583 that the angel Aniel is the chief governor general of the Great Period, which he had noted in his book Rich and Famous Discoveries. But that is definitely not the secret center that is hidden in the book of Rich and Famous Discoveries. There is only one copy of Rich and Famous Discoveries, which is still partially extant. So there's only a portion of this book that still remains. The rest of it has been lost to history. The first section, which deals with Solomon's Ophirian voyage, is wholly lacking. So that the whole part that's dealing with Solomon's voyage was taken out, and probably for the truth that was contained in it. However, Samuel Purchas had a copy, which he drew on freely for his pilgrims, Purchas His Pilgrims. So Purchas had a copy of this Famous and Rich Discoveries, even the first section, which has been totally lost to history, and he used that to write Purchas His Pilgrims. Now, this must be the most important topic in Purchas His Pilgrims, because it starts out in the very first book, Volume 1, Purchas His Pilgrims, Volume 1, Chapter 1, King Solomon and his voyage to Ophir, the Ophirian voyage. And basically this whole book goes on about Ophirian navigation, Christianity, the whole apostles here, but throughout the whole book, it is talking about Solomon and his Ophirian voyages. And of course, the book also covers Prester John, Christians in Asia. So Christians in Tartaria, once again linked to Prester John, and right after that, it's going into Christians in America. Now, Purchas His Pilgrims, Volume 11, about the Tartarians, is a mind-blowing book. So I'm sure that this one, I haven't gotten through the whole book yet, part of it, but I'm sure this book is just as mind-blowing. And the only place where we're going to get some kind of an idea about what John Dee wrote about in regards to Solomon's Ophirian voyages. But I still want to read Famous and Rich Discoveries and figure out what the secret center of that book is. Now, the only place I could find it is over here in the Washington University of St. Louis in Missouri of the United States. So I contacted that library to see if they would be able to scan it and make it available for digital use, and they couldn't help me out. So the next thing to do was to go to my local library and submit a interlibrary loan request. So one library sends a loan request over to the second library, and they said there's going to be a $10 fee, and that library could find titles by John Dee, but was unable to find Rich and Famous Discoveries in a digital format. And of course, I said no problem. On the $10, I could pay. I could pay definitely more than that to get this book. And email me back. We've heard back from the library. They put on a lot of conditions. They want special shipping and insurance, and only looked at the library, not available for checkout. So at this time, we're not going to be able to borrow it. And sorry, we can't get the book for you. There's of course, they're not going to get the book for me. And I was trying to come up with some alternative option if I had to drive to Missouri, anything. And I was probably a little bit less than pleasant. I said, such a tragedy and quite pathetic. But she said, I understand your disappointment. And looks like the two libraries got together and did some digging. And they were able to find that the original came from the Cotton manuscripts, which were donated to the British Museum. So the Cotton manuscripts here at the British Library is a library assembled by Sir Robert Bruce Cotton, 1571-1631, and it has been described as the most important collection of manuscripts ever assembled in Britain by a private individual. Of course, Cotton had writings from John Dee, and thank the Lord, the British Library has digitized these works in this volume of Rich and Famous and Rich Discoveries, 1577 by John Dee, and it begins on page 26R and goes to page 269V. The only surviving copy of Rich and Famous Discoveries by John Dee. Now it looks like the book was damaged in a fire. Hard to say if that was an accident or intentional, because there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who want this book burned. And John Dee has beautiful handwriting. It unfortunately is quite hard to read. Dee's handwriting is important and interesting, and it's sufficiently characteristic to be identifiable. It perhaps is a little too elaborate for perfection, but admirably demonstrates his calligraphic skill, and he used an ultra-cursive fast italic, which is often difficult to read. So there's, of course, more on John Dee's specific handwriting style, but it's almost a style that needs to be studied to even be read. Of all Asia, we could see right here, but to get a comprehensive idea of what this particular page is talking about certainly would take some translation. But supposedly a text right here on Tartaria, and I have found hints about Atlantis, Tartaria, King Solomon's voyage, Christianity. Here's an example right here. There's upon the premise about the Ophirian voyage. So although the first chapter is missing, the first section of this book is gone, which thoroughly discussed Solomon's Ophirian voyage, he is at least still talking about somewhat here on this page. Here he's talking about Hyperborea, the island at the North Pole. And here, possibly talking about Atlantis or the Atlantic Ocean. But look at right here, we have 1253. That is when the Tartarians started to overspread the world like a flood. And it talks right here about the great or perhaps grand Cham or Khan, Mangu Kam. This looks like Cathay. And who else but Roger Bacon? It says Roger Bacon is this a had? Roger Bacon had a copy. As you can see, there's quite a bit of work here to translate this book, but here again, 1253, and I'm just really curious about what this book says and what is the secret center of this book? Talking again about Mengü Cham here, Mengü Khan and Kublai Khan. We have talked about these guys at length in the Tartarian Christianity series. So what a invaluable piece of text right here. If only we had a simple translation. Now this book has never been translated. It's never been published. This is the last remaining fragment of it. And it would be amazing if we could translate this book, figure out what it's talking about, what happened in 1307, and get this thing once and for all actually published into a book that could sit on the shelf and be picked up and actually read. Now, of course, it's hundreds of pages long, so what a huge piece of work to get this translated and maybe start to figure out what the secret center of the book is. So a project which is out of my scope of work right now. I certainly want to focus on getting to the North Pole first and then the South Pole, 90 degrees south, before I get locked up in the library for years on end translating books. But perhaps you guys, the viewers, can help out if you translate a page, translate a section. Maybe you'll find some sections that are easy to translate or have some interesting information, or you never know what it's going to take to unlock that secret center of this book. But certainly definitely one of the coolest books I've found in quite a long time, and a very rare piece of work. I myself have been concerned about the truth of Tartaria and how it's been buried. So although I've been critical of John Dee in the past, I find that I'm agreeing with him at least on the fact that on a survey of Asia or Tartaria, there is a scrupulous concern for the truth. And it seems as though this book has been written by John Dee to address his concerns for the truth and get the truth out to the people. Now, Purchas His Pilgrims, Volume 11, likely draws its information from this book of John Dee's, because Purchas had a copy of John Dee's, this book of John Dee's. So the information that we have, which is covered in my Tartarian Christianity series, and is covered in this book, Volume 11 of Purchas His Pilgrims, that is likely his source comes from John Dee. So if we're unable to make any progress translating this, I think it's worth digging in and learning what we can. But the closest alternative will be Volume 11 to cover the Tartarian aspects, and Volume 1, which covers the Solomon's Ophirian voyages. And looping back to the very beginning, I'm starting to wonder if the reason why John Dee is portrayed as such an evil man is because they don't want people getting close to the information which he uncovered in his books, especially his unprinted and unpublished books, the ones which contained matters so secret that they were to be utterly suppressed. Well, whether they want the information suppressed or not, I think it's worth it to dig in and learn what we can. See you guys in the next video as I work on my translation skills over here.